So we're picking up in Pirkei, chapter 3 of Pirkei Avos, and we're starting with the fifth Mishna, Mishna Hey. Again, there's different ways that they're divided, but we're going to call this Mishna Hey, Mishna number 5. And the Mishna says as follows: Rabbi Chanina ben Chachinai Omer. Rabbi Chanina, the son of Chachinai, says, Haneor balayla, one who wakes up or is awake at night, v'hamahalech baderech, and one who walks on the road, yichidi, alone, v'hamefane libo levatala, and one who turns their heart to idleness, harezeh mischayev binafsho. This person is, here they translate, mortally guilty, responsible for their life. So it says seemingly three things, and for the again, we'll see different ways to read it, but seemingly three things that if you do them, you're responsible for your life in some way, mortally guilty. And they are one who is awake at night, one who walks on the way alone, and one who turns their heart to idle matters. Okay, so what is the Mishnah telling us? What exactly are these three things? What is so bad about them? So the Midrash Shmuel, in classic fashion, is going to bring a number of different approaches, and we'll go through them. So the first he brings from the Bartanura, which is one of the primary commentaries on the Mishnah in general. So he says that the nighttime is a dangerous time, and particularly to be out alone at night. So he combines these things together, basically. So the first approach is actually they're not three different things; they are one thing. So he reads it as follows: one who's awake at night and decides to walk on the road alone, which is dangerous. And not only do they put themselves in such a dangerous situation, but they don't do anything to protect themselves, like to think in Torah thoughts, which could provide a person protection. So that person is putting their life on the line. That person is mischayev binafsho. So it's all one thing according to the Bartanura. One who's awake at night and walks alone on the road and puts themselves in some level of danger, so they can at least, do the little bit they could do, or maybe a lot, and think in words of Torah, which could provide them with some protection. But if they don't do that, so that person is putting their life on the line. That's the Bartanura's approach. A similar vein, he brings from the Meiri, who says that these are different things, but they're all about taking risks and doing things that are dangerous. It's three different things, but each is dangerous in its own way. And even though he says, and this relates back to our series on bitachon, on trusting God, he says, even though, God guides all events, but a person shouldn't act negligently and put themselves in dangerous situations. And we talked about that, either that could lead to the natural result of a dangerous situation, which is that the danger comes about, and maybe that's in what is decreed upon the person, but also it could be that, no, God says, I can't let harm befall this person, but that can take away from the person's merits. God, if God, so to speak, has to intervene to set the person back on the path that they're supposed to be on. They're not supposed to, die at this moment. So, and yet they're risking their life. So that could take away from the person's merits. So, but that was what we talked about from the Chovos Halavos. The Meiri just says that even though everything is guided by God, but one should not put themselves in danger. And And these are three things that are dangerous. One is a person doesn't sleep. You stay up all night. So we're not talking about somebody who just can't fall asleep, but somebody who doesn't take care of themselves and doesn't get enough sleep. And that could be dangerous. The person goes for a long time without rest. Eventually it wears down the body and makes them susceptible to becoming sick, etc. So that's number one. That's the first thing that a person shouldn't do. The person should make sure to get enough sleep. He quotes the classic formulation that Maimonides also gives, the Rambam, which is 8 hours of sleep. Although the commentaries say, well, not everybody needs 8 hours. So if a person can sleep less than 8 hours and still function well, then that's okay. As long as they're being productive. But that's what he says. Number one is a person should make sure to get enough sleep. And number two is maybe the more straightforward one in reading it is to go on to go alone on a road. It could be dangerous. Again, we're not talking about our highway. You're driving in your car on the road alone, not necessarily dangerous in and of itself, but we're talking about going in a dangerous place, a dangerous highway where there are bandits and the like. So, or what maybe the equivalent now is for us is walking through a dangerous neighborhood, right? So that's putting oneself in danger. So he says that's something that the Mishnah is telling us to avoid. And the third is somebody who turns their heart to idle matters. What does that mean? A person's idle. A person is not being productive in any way. In general, a person who is not engaged, even productivity is certainly good, but even you can have social engagement or whatever. The problem is a person who has nothing to do all day, so that's not healthy. And it's the way that the Meiri says it. Again, this is a medieval commentator, but he says that if a person is idle and bored and all day long, so that could actually affect a person's mental capacity, and eventually, that can actually be quite dangerous for the person, whether it's because they end up with mental illness or mental illness that leads to suicide, but to be completely idle and not have anything to do, he says is another dangerous act or lack of activity. So three things the Mishnah is telling us that are dangerous. One is to not get enough sleep. Number two is to walk on dangerous roads by oneself. And number three is to be completely idle, which is dangerous, which isn't good for our mental capacity. That's how the Meiri warns us. So according to his approach, it's a very practical life lessons from Rabbi Chanina ben Chachinai. And again, it's similar to the first approach, the Bartanura. The Bartanura just had it as one thing: don't go by yourself at night without thinking in Torah as a protection. Okay. The Midrash Shmuel himself offers a couple of other possibilities. Number one, he says that there's two categories here. There's one who's up at night and his heart is idle, and then there's somebody who's traveling on the way and his heart is idle. Meaning what? So he says, okay, a person should get some sleep. Even if a person is pushing themselves to study Torah at night and they fall asleep, they get tired. Okay, that's life. And we're not going to tell such a person that they did something wrong because they fell asleep. But if a person is awake, they can't fall asleep. And what do they do with their time? They while away their time, unproductively. That's what the Mishnah is talking about. Such a person is not is mischayev b'nafsho. They are responsible for their life. Why are they responsible for their life? Because they're not engaging in Torah, which is a protection, which provides protection. So and length of days. So a person who's awake at night, meaning a person is able to stay awake, and yet they're idle and they're not using that time productively. So that person is mortally guilty. That's the first part of the Mishnah. That's the Neyor Balayla, the one who's awake at night and idle. And then there's the person who's traveling on the way and idle. What's that talking about? So it's specifically if you're traveling alone and you're idle. He says, if you're traveling with a friend, so, okay, you should be engaging in Torah, but there's an understanding when you're two people, you start schmoozing and you get distracted. He says that's almost out of your control, almost out of your control. Maybe because you blame the other person. They're the one who keeps talking to me about other things and changing the subject. I'm just trying to talk about Torah and spiritual and growth and they keep, talking about other things, right? Okay. Anyways, the point is when it's two people, he says, okay, that we understand you fall into conversation, but if you're alone, so what are you doing? You have nothing else to do. You should be engaged in thinking in Torah, or nowadays the equivalent would be you should have a recording of a Torah class on for yourself, because what else are you doing when you're alone? By the way, I should mention that it's also good to think. You don't have to be listening to something. You don't have to be listening to Torah class. You don't have to be listening to the radio. If a person just takes, when they're alone, just thinks a little bit, that's extremely valuable also. So that's not idle. That's not mefana libo livatala. That's, just because I'm not listening to a Torah class, doesn't mean I'm not being productive. Somebody can, there's much growth comes from just thinking about things and thinking about life and thinking about where I'm holding and what I'm doing and what I should be doing. And that's extremely valuable as well. So a person's alone, and that's actually a great time for contemplation, meditation, and that's the second person the Mishnah refers to as someone who is mortally guilty if they don't take advantage of that and they are idle. Their heart is turned to idle matters instead. So that's the Midrash Shmuel's first approach, and so he's breaking the Mishnah into two sets. So actually, we had our first approach was the Mishnah is only one case, one scenario. Person's up at night, on the road alone, and not thinking in Torah. It's one scenario. It's all the same scenario. This approach it's two scenarios. It's either somebody's up at night and not thinking in Torah, or scenario number two, they're traveling, they're walking alone and not engaged in Torah. Two different scenarios. And then the other way we said was actually three scenarios. Each one is its own case. There's a person who is who's doesn't sleep enough, stays up at night too much. There's the person who travels alone in dangerous places. And then there's the person who is idle in general, doesn't use their time, is not productive, or is not doing anything. Each of those scenarios themselves are dangerous. So three ways to read the Mishnah so far, and each one is breaking up the Mishnah in different ways. One case, two cases, and three cases. Okay, the final approach that I want to share is that it looks at the Mishnah more as a metaphor. And that is that we can look at the term night as sort of the night, when the sun sets on life, when the person is older. So and the Mishnah is telling us that we can't wait till we're old to wake up. Haneyor balayla, one who only wakes up when it's the nighttime of their life, when the sun is setting on life. So that person has lost out on much opportunity. We have to wake up when we're when we're a little younger and still have more time left. So that's what we have to do. That's what the Mishnah is telling us. And if we wait too long, so that's somebody who is mortally guilty. They've not taking advantage of their life. So we have to wake up while we're still young. And although we're all different ages, we're all still young. So we can all still, and I think we're all awake. There's always more awakening that we can have. Although the people who don't have their videos on, I can't tell if you're awake or sleeping. But no, that's on me. If I put you to sleep in the first 10 minutes of the class, well, that's my fault. But we have to awake while we're still young. That's the first part of the Mishnah. And then the second part of the Mishnah is one who goes on the way alone. So again, understanding this not as you're walking through a dangerous neighborhood or walking on a dangerous highway, but more as a metaphor for life, the way of life, the path of life, and it's the good path of life, the Torah path of life. But you're walking it alone. In other words, a person says, the Hebrew that he uses is Shalom alai nafshi. He says, I'm good, and he or she doesn't worry about other people, meaning at how the spiritual state of other people. Like I'm doing, I'm a good God-fearing person, and that's all that counts, right? And they ignore the state of their fellow brothers and sisters amongst the Jewish people. So that's also what the Mishnah is calling out and saying that that such a person is mischayev benafsho. And here we can actually understand it more on the word nafsho literally means his soul. The person is responsible for their soul. They're morally responsible for their soul. And I think there's a deeper message here, which is that all our souls are linked. And that's the deeper concept of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh. All Jews are responsible for each other. It's because ultimately all our souls are linked. And if one soul has not reached perfection, so that affects all other souls. And so if a person says, well, I've worked on myself, I've grown, I study Torah, I have developed good character traits, I've developed myself, I'm doing good, but then they ignore other people. So then they're still lacking then, because their soul is still lacking because the other souls are not perfected yet. So that's the person who walks the path alone. Person who walks the path alone is mischayev benafsho. They're responsible for their own soul. They're morally responsible for their soul because they've let the other connections, soul connections, remain in a state of imperfection. And that's the second clause. Then the third clause is one who is turns their heart to idle matters, so that he comes back again to similar to what we said before, that a person is not engaged in study or even other things, and they're idle, so that affects our mental state and could lead one to mental illness or even God forbid suicide. So that comes from total idleness, like same as was said by the Meiri before. So this approach, at least for the first two clauses, looks at it as more metaphorical. Again, the one who wakes up at night refers to someone who only wakes up in their sunset years of their life, in the nighttime of their life. Such a person has missed out. We have to wake up while we're still young, and get inspired while we're still young, and if not, so then they're hurting their soul, and they're morally responsible for that. And the second is the one who walks the path alone, walks the path of Torah, but walks it alone and doesn't look to see how they could be supportive and role model and inspiring to their brethren and sisterin, their brothers and sisters. So So that such a person is not just that it's wrong, but they're hurting their soul because of all those soul connections. Okay, that is Mishnah Hey. Any questions or comments before we move on to the next Mishnah? No. Okay. So the next Mishnah, Mishnah Vav, Mishnah number 6. Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana Omer. Rabbi Nechunya, the son of the Kana, says, Ben, I guess his name was Hakana. Ben Hakana says, Kla Makabel Olav Ol Torah. Anyone who accepts upon themselves the yoke of Torah, Ma'avirin mimanu ol malchus v'ol derech eretz. They remove from him the yoke of malchus, of kingship or government, and the yoke of derech eretz, which here it translates the worldly concerns, the way of the land. Maybe it could refer to the need to earn a living, a livelihood, or at least the effort involved. That's one who accepts upon themselves the yoke of Torah, the yoke of the government and of worldly concerns is removed from them. But one who casts off the yoke of Torah, nosting olav ol malchus ol derech eretz. So then the yoke of kingship and the yoke of, or the yoke of the government and the yoke of derech eretz, of worldly concerns, is placed upon them. So just on the most simple, just to understand what the words mean even, what is this yoke of government and the yoke of derech eretz, of worldly concerns? So the simple understanding of the Mishnah is it refers to certain government pressures and requirements, taxes, and maybe, in certain societies where the government restricted what a person could do, and in particular in their Jewish observance. But I think on the most basic level, it means like difficult taxes. Again, it's a little hard for us to relate. I think because we could relate to having to pay taxes, but maybe because we pay the same as anyone else, you could argue if it's fair, but at least there's an argument about it. There's a discussion about it around it. Certain societies, number one, Jews paid more taxes than other people, and number two, sometimes there was no, it wasn't a democracy, so there, like, you felt like you had no say in what was going on. So there, it could be viewed as even more unfair. Anyways, that's how the commentaries understand on a more simple level the idea of the yoke of the government is taxes and the like, and the yoke of derech eretz is worldly concerns, is the concerns of earning a livelihood, and that also can be placed or cast away depending on how we act. Yeah, Robert.
It just sounds like what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says in the Gemara.
Which is what?
That if you are really devoted to Hashem, then other people will do your work for you.
Oh, you mean yeah. That's.
But the Gemara says for most people that doesn't work.
Right.
What's an interesting contrast to it.
Yes. So, well, yes. Okay.
Maybe.
Right. Yeah. It's a discussion. How this fits into that. We also had the Mishnah, last year about. Some people might have seen it more recently than last year, but we learned it last year about Torah im derech eretz, Torah with earning a livelihood, and how that fits into that discussion. Fine. Anyways, so let's see what Midrash Shmuel has to say about this Mishnah. So again, we have numerous approaches. And in his first approach, he actually carefully breaks down the words of the Mishnah and notes some interesting changes as the Mishnah goes. So he says, if you read the Mishnah carefully, so it says, one who accepts the yoke of Torah, the yoke of the government and of a livelihood is removed from them. But one who casts it away, the yoke is placed on them. Now it could have said, one who accepts the yoke of Torah, the yoke of government and livelihood is not placed on them. But if they cast away the yoke of Torah, then it is placed on them. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say it either is not placed on them or it is placed on them. It says it is removed from them or it is placed on them. So that's a subtle difference that he notes. And on the flip side, a related observation is it says one who accepts the yoke of Torah gets this and this. And instead of saying, but one who doesn't accept the yoke of Torah, doesn't say that, it says, but one who casts away the yoke of Torah. So is that different? Is it different to not accept and to cast away? So these are some of the observations that he has, and he comes out with the following approach to the Mishnah. And he says that there's actually three types of people. There's one who accepts the yoke of Torah. There's one who, let's say, doesn't accept it, but doesn't cast it away. And that's not discussed in the Mishnah explicitly. And then there's one who casts it away. And it breaks down as follows. And he says, we don't just mean in general that one accepts the yoke of Torah upon themselves, but rather what it means is somebody who accepts it each day anew and is constantly looking to improve and looking to grow every day. They have that's what it means to accept it. Somebody who doesn't accept it but doesn't cast it away is somebody who just lives the way, this is what I do. I follow the Torah, but I'm not adding, I'm not subtracting, I'm just doing my thing. That's the middle ground that's not spoken about in the Mishnah. What the Mishnah is talking about when it says somebody who accepts upon themselves the yoke of Torah, it means every day they want to continue to accept more and more and to grow in their observance and their connection to God. So such a person, it's not just that God will not, that they won't have the yoke of kingship, of government and livelihood placed upon them, but even more, even if they already have it upon themselves, then it gets removed. So the first group, in reward for their initiative, such a person's initiative and drive to keep taking on more and more. So it's not just that they won't have a yoke of government placed upon them, but if it's already upon them, it gets removed. And that's the first category. The second category discussed in the Mishnah is the opposite end. That's the person who not only do they not accept to keep growing and I want to do more, but they go in the other direction and they cast it away. They cast off the yoke of serving God and they become less and less involved and weaker in their service of God. So that person is the second type of person that's discussed in the Mishnah. And such a person not only does it's not only that God doesn't remove from them the yoke, but actually they get a yoke added to them of government and livelihood, that it becomes more difficult, the Mishnah says, for such a person. And then there's the in-between, which is not spoken about in the Mishnah, but we can infer it from the Mishnah, which is somebody who just does their thing. I'm not growing, I'm not adding to my observance, but I'm not doing less. So such a person, the Mishnah doesn't say, but it's just they continue on whatever their situation is. It continues as it's been. So whatever yoke of government and yoke of livelihood that they've had up till now, so that will continue as is. This is the teaching of Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. I have heard many times that there's not really such thing as this middle category. Now, I didn't hear about it in the context of this Mishnah, but just in general, that there's no such thing as a person who's just remaining the status quo. You either, if you're not trying to go up, then you end up going down. Life is like somebody who's trying to walk up a down escalator or up a muddy hill. You have to keep climbing in order to get to, even to remain in one place. You always have to be climbing. Hopefully when we climb, we climb, but at the very least, if we put in the effort to climb, we'll at least remain where we are. If we don't put in the effort to grow, then we end up slipping. We end up sliding down. So perhaps that's why he didn't bother mentioning this middle ground, because maybe there's no such thing, right? It's either you're trying to grow or you're casting away service of God.
Rabbi Shaps, can I ask a quick question?
Please.
So for the A person, you said that having the yoke removed is they're being rewarded by having the yoke removed. So for the C person, is it the punishment that they're kind of having that extra yokes added?
Yeah, that's the language he uses.
Oh, he does. Okay.
Yeah, he calls it onish. Okay, and then just in terms of this yoke, and the order that it's presented. So he notes in the beginning of the Mishnah, it says that a person who accepts, and the way that we're described, the way that he's learning, it means a person who every day accepts to keep learning and keep growing and improve their service of God. So such a person, the yoke of government and the yoke of livelihood is removed from them. And it says it specifically in that order. It says first the yoke of government, followed by the yoke of livelihood. And he says that is in a direction that's said as something that's more and more, more and more novel. In Hebrew, lo zu afsu, not just this, but even this. And what he means is that, one is maybe unnatural and one is natural, right? One, the government, so that's not a natural, it's not built into the nature of the world that we have pressures from the government. That's people, making decisions and they can affect us. But it's not necessarily equal in all places and all people in all places. But the need to provide for ourselves is a natural part of the world, and that's everybody has that to an equal extent. People receive it in different ways, but everybody has that same need to provide for themselves and their families. So the Mishnah is kind of building up and saying that as a reward, not only will the yoke of the government, which is not equal to everybody and not and somewhat unnatural, not automatic, built into the system of nature, but even that which is built in, the need to provide for ourselves will that yoke will be removed, and we'll find that Rabbi Nechonia is telling us, is assuring us that we will find that our livelihood comes easily without much effort if we accept upon ourselves the yoke of Torah. And then in the second half of the Mishnah, where it goes in the other direction, you might expect it then should flip directions, because then when we're talking about removing it, you would say not only will the yoke, when talking about placing upon ourselves the yoke, you'd say not only will the yoke of earning a livelihood be placed upon ourselves, but even the yoke of kingship. So maybe it should have flipped the order, but just continuing the same order that it did in the first half of the Mishnah. Yeah, this is just a sort of a technical point in terms of the ordering of the words. Okay, so that's approach number one to reading this Mishnah. Number two is that he suggests is totally different reading. We're not talking about, when we talk about Malchus, the kingship, the government, we don't mean the government. We don't mean the United States government or wherever you might live. We mean Malchus Shamayim, the kingdom of heaven. That if a person accepts upon the yoke of Torah, the yoke of heaven is removed from them. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't sound so good, right? So he says what it means is heavenly decrees are removed. And there's an idea that if a person reaches a certain spiritual state, so tzaddik goes there, a tzaddik, a righteous person decrees, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mekayim, and God fulfills that decree. In other words, a person can reach a state where God infuses them, instills within them a power to override His decrees, and that's the malchus that one can override, the malchus shamayim. If they reach this high level, so then the yoke of heaven is removed from them, the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, in that they can override some of God's decrees. Now, doesn't probably there's limitations on that, but that's a power that could be given to a person, and to override nature, to override derech eretz, to override the way of the world, to override the natural. And he gives, for example, Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel the prophet, brought rain during a time that it wasn't supposed to rain. And Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, stopped the rain when it was supposed to rain, for 3 years. So God can sometimes hand over to a righteous individual the ability to override his decrees and to override nature. And that could be another way to read this Mishnah. And finally, the last approach that we'll share is that this Mishnah is a conclusion to all of the Mishnahs in the Perek, in the chapter up till now. And we saw numerous approaches of how a person avoids sin. So the first Mishnah in the chapter was Akavya ben Mahalal. And Akavya said, look at 3 things and the person won't come to sin. And the 3 things were, know where we came from, right, that we come from a putrid drop, and where we're going, to a place of dust, worms, and maggots, and before whom you will give justification and reckoning before God. That was Akavya ben Mahalal's advice for how to avoid sin. Then we had Rabbi Chanina, Skan HaKohanim, who said, pray for the peace in the kingdom, because if people are not afraid of the government, so people would swallow each other alive. And that's a way to avoid sin, is the government's laws and enforcement, a person avoids sin. And then we had a couple of Mishnahs about Torah study. We had Rabbi Chanina ben Tradion said that people who sit, if they don't have Torah amongst them, that's the singing of scoffers, and talked about how God's presence comes to those who study Torah together or speak in Torah. And then last week we had Rabbi Shimon, who also talks about 3 people who are eating at a meal and they don't speak in Torah. It's as if they ate from dead idols, but if they do, so then it's as if they're eating from God's table. So the previous 2 Mishnahs talked about the importance of Torah and involving Torah in sort of all the parts of our lives. So now along comes and then we had our first Mishnah today, Rabbi Chanina ben Pachinai, also focusing a little bit on not being idle, but rather, again, on the most simple level, being engaged in Torah when one's up at night or on the way, etc. So now along comes Rabbi Nechemia ben Akana, and Rabbi Nechemia ben Akana says that out of all those ideas that have been presented up till now, the majority is correct. The ones who focused on Torah, that's the correct approach. That's his conclusion. And he's saying that if you do that, if a person is steeped in Torah study, so they don't have to focus on where they come from and where they're going, and they don't need the enforcement of the government to keep them in line. A person who's steeped in Torah will naturally grow and arrive at a state where they avoid sin, and that's what the Mishnah is telling us. And he reads the Mishnah as follows: what does it mean that one who accepts upon themselves the yoke of Torah then the yoke of kingship is removed from them, the yoke of government and the yoke of derech eretz. It means the yoke, the need to think about those things or to have those things that were previously mentioned in the first two Mishnas in the chapter. The first Mishnah talked about the natural way of the world, where we come from, a putrid drop, where we're going, dusting maggots. A person who accepts upon themselves the yoke of Torah, they don't have to think about that. They don't need the yoke of the derech eretz, of the way of the world, of where we come from, where we're going. That doesn't have to be their driving force in avoiding sin. And they also don't need the yoke of government. The second Mishnah, where we need the government to enforce to being enforcers, that people stay in line. If a person's engaged in Torah and accepts upon themselves the yoke of Torah, then they don't need that to keep them in line. And that's the Mishnah. But if a person does not, but if a person who casts away the law of Torah, so then these yokes are placed on them, meaning then they do need those yokes. If a person is not engaged in Torah, so then Torah itself protects a person from sin, Torah study. But if a person does not involve themselves in Torah study, so then they need other protections from sin. We place upon them those other yokes because they need those other yokes of focusing on where they came from and where they're going, or focusing on or the need for a government enforcement. They need that yoke in order to keep them in line and away from sin. So just to quickly summarize what we said about this Mishnah, I think we gave three different approaches. Number one is that it's talking about somebody who renews themselves. They're mekabel. They accept daily anew to keep growing and to keep adding to their connection to God. So that such a person, they are rewarded by the yoke of government, of taxes and the like, and the yoke of livelihood being removed from them. On the other hand, one who goes in the opposite direction and casts it away, so then these yokes are placed on them. And then there's a middle ground that's unspoken about. Somebody just stays the status quo, so their situation stays the status quo. Number two, we said, is that the malchus, the kingship that we're talking about is God's kingdom and God's decrees. That a person can reach a spiritual state where God gives him the power to override his decrees and to override nature at times. And then the last one relates this Mishnah to the previous Mishnahs in the chapter, and is a concluding discussion where Rabbi Nechemiah says that if you accept the yoke of Torah, you don't need the yoke that was talked about in the first chapter, the first Mishnah, of reminding ourselves of where we come from and where we're going, that that we're from a future drop, we're going to be in a grave soon. You don't need that. Torah itself will protect us from sin, and you also don't need the yoke of the government to enforce our proper conduct, because again, Torah alone will make sure will give us the right perspective on life, so that we conduct ourselves in the way that the Torah wants and avoid sin. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.